What's going on, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Get Over Yourself podcast, a podcast dedicated to helping young entrepreneurs succeed in both business and in life. Today's episode is actually very special for me. Right next to me, I have my uncle, Brad Davis, founder of Roxberry Smoothie Co., and also a franchise expert when it comes to the restaurant industry. He's going to be giving us some insights inside of the franchising world, why it makes sense for some entrepreneurs, and why it could be the end of others. He's also going to be sharing some of his success stories, as well as some of the difficulties when it came to founding Roxberry and his journey throughout entrepreneurship. So with that being said, let's jump into the episode. Brad, thanks for joining us today. Super awesome. I've had a couple family members on the podcast before from like my sisters, but having one of my uncles come on the show is pretty special to me. So thanks for joining. So Brad, awesome figure out here in Utah. For all the Utah listeners where this podcast is based, I'm sure you've seen Roxberry when you're driving down the road. You have, I believe, 25 locations here in Utah.
Yes, yeah.
So if you are here in the state of Utah and you haven't seen one of them, I would be shocked at this point.
Hopefully they have.
Hopefully they have. Hopefully they've been as well. You also have a couple locations out in Idaho. So you obviously come from a background that's actually kind of unique to the restaurant industry. And I want to start off with this. You went to law school and you didn't really have any idea of what you wanted to do. And at the time, you got some inspiration from actually my dad. He had just finished law school. He said, all right, this might be a good path that you could actually go down and figure out what the heck you want to do with your lives.
That's exactly right. You know, when growing up, Brandon, your grandpa, my father, was a general contractor. And I remember like laying in bed thinking about, business. And when I would think about business, I would think about the structure of business. My mindset would go to, how would I form my business? What would I call my business? How would I legally do the things that I needed to do with business? Whereas, if you talk to my dad, he was all about the function of business. What product am I going to sell or what service am I going to sell? But my mind was more logical. And so when I watched your brother going to law school or your dad going to law school, it resonated with me. And so I thought, man, I'm going to follow that example.
One interesting thing that I think happened when you were going to law school is you recognized, or I guess this is a little bit post law school, you're working in these larger firms. And as we all know, anyone who's seen the show Suits, I'm sure it doesn't actually give the accurate depiction of the attorneys day to day. But what it does show is how crazy hard attorneys have to work. And I think that's just a caveat. If you become an attorney, you want to work for a large firm, you're expected to put in a lot of hours. And you just mentioned this to me recently about if you didn't hit a certain amount of billable hours, you're going to be fired. You had to hit certain benchmarks. And tell us a little bit about what it was like. So you went through growing up. You said, okay, I look at my dad, my grandpa in this case. I look at my dad and I say, he started something and I love the business side of it. Then you go in and you say, okay, I want to do something, but I like seeing the logistics of the business. I like seeing the grand picture. You're more of a visionary on that aspect. Then you go to law school. You try and figure out what the heck you want to do. Now you've kind of ditched the entrepreneurial spirit altogether when you started working for the big law firm. What was your mindset at that point and what were you learning?
Yeah, I don't know that I ditched the entrepreneurial spirit, but it certainly was on the back burner for a while because law just, it took over, my everything. It was kind of cool because, law school was fun. Loved the analysis of law school. Well, then you graduate and, obviously you naturally go into the practice of law. And initially I was with a small firm. In fact, it was the firm that your dad bought. So I worked with her. She was awesome. I was a law clerk with her, every year in law school. And then I ultimately worked with her. And when you work with a small firm, it's different. The pressures aren't as high and the requirements aren't as crazy. But then I moved down to Orange County and I worked for a large law firm. I think there was 40 or 50 attorneys at the firm. And and the pressure mounted. All of a sudden, you were paid very well, but you were expected to perform at a high level every day. And if you didn't bill the hours that they could in turn bill the clients, you weren't on track to be a partner. And if you weren't on track to be a partner, they really didn't want you there. They only wanted people that were high performers and highly energetic and make things happen. And I was a litigator, so I was in the courtrooms every day. And so in order to be prepared in the courtroom, you had to be prepared in the law library before you got to the courtroom, because you didn't want to, not perform for one of your clients. The last thing you want to do is get to court and, forgot to do something and a judge shuts you down on something that you need for your client, because then you've disappointed your client and you've disappointed your firm and you've disappointed yourself. So you kind of by necessity, you're working a lot of hours. And as a result, other things have to give in your life. And that's where I learned that in order to have a good balance between life and family, it was very hard for me to do that in a large law firm.
You recently just shared a story with me, and I feel like this could resonate with a lot of the young entrepreneurs out there. They need to learn these lessons now so it doesn't come to this later. You shared a story about one day you were out working late. I believe it was a Saturday, and you're sitting there, you're tallying up your billable hours, and then all of a sudden you recognize what day it was. If you could jump into that a little.
Yeah. So working on weekends was a regular thing. It was a pretty standard thing. And so this particular Saturday, I was working, and it got to the evening time where you're tallying up all the hours that you worked, and you have to write down in meticulous order, what clients you worked for and how long you worked for them. And then you have to correlate the date to it. And so I looked at the date, and it was my son's birthday, Brandon. And it was really hard because that morning, obviously I knew it was his birthday. And so I promised him, hey, I'm going to be home and we're going to celebrate your birthday and it's going to be great. And then I just got so caught up in work. And I just, I'm an all-in type guy, and I was passionate about the practice of law. But that passion was kind of overshadowing the other priorities I had in life. And so when I saw that it was my son's birthday, of course I was crazy ashamed, and I was frustrated, and I was sad, and I knew that I'd let my son down. And so I made a decision right there that I was going to walk away from the practice of law. Not that the practice of law is bad. There are many great men and women that find that balance. But for me, I couldn't find that balance because I was such an all-in guy that I just couldn't find the balance. I couldn't figure out how to be the guy that I needed to be to my wife and to my children, and to be the guy that I needed to be at work.
That's kind of the reason why I actually wanted you to share that specifically. I feel like sometimes when we sit down at our desks for the day and we kind of lock into our zone or whatever area you're in, whatever realm you're in when you're working, for guys like you and me, and for everyone who listens to this type of podcast, you enjoy working. Working isn't a bad thing for you. You
Correct.
Enjoy sitting down, figuring out issues, solving those problems, helping other people solve those same kind of problems they're having inside of their lives. You enjoy that kind of stuff.
I do.
And
yeah.
So when you got into that exact scenario, you sit there, you're working on a Saturday. It's another typical day in the office for you. Nothing really changes. And then you get that hindsight. Oh crap, I just missed my son's birthday.
Right.
And that's the message I wanted everyone to hear, because so often you're going to sit down, and me and my partner talk about this all the time, and we're just getting going in our journey, but we'll sit down and we start working for the day. And next thing we know, it's 2-3 o'clock and we're like, oh wait, we didn't even eat lunch yet. We should probably eat lunch. Then by the time we're having our 20-minute lunch or whatever, we look up and it's already 6 p.m. And we kind of, one of our boundaries that we tried to set inside of our business this summer is making sure that we would have time with our wives. We don't have any kids yet, neither me or him. But one of our parameters is, all right, we're going to show up and we're going to be trying to finish up by 6:30 at the latest, so we can go home and actually hang out with our families at night. And it is very easy to let those little things slip by, especially when you're in the intense part of a project. But looking back now, after you finished working as an attorney, and we'll jump into your entrepreneurial story here in just a second, but where you're at today has obviously changed over the years of how much time you had to put into the actual business. Where you're at right now, you don't have to put in as much time. Correct. Because the operations are already there. There's only so much you could physically do in the day right now. And you get it. That's the joy of being an entrepreneur. You grind, hustle. And now you get to enjoy some of the fruits of your labor. So tell us about the different evolutions you saw throughout your career of working a ton, missing family versus where you're at now?
Yeah, yeah. Well, within 3 months of that day where I missed my son's birthday, we had walked away from law and we moved to Utah to work with a startup restaurant company called Jamba Juice. And it was kind of, I left one fire and jumped into another one in a lot of ways because we grew Jamba Juice to 110 stores in 3 years. So it was fast paced, but that suited me because I burn really hot, Brandon. And when I work, I'm passionate about it, and I love doing it. But I had to, because I didn't have the billable hour requirement that my law firm was requiring. I could temper it a little bit more because I wasn't worried about being on partnership track. I wasn't worried about, I knew that I was a high performer in my job, so I wasn't worried about getting fired or anything like that. So I was able to take a little bit of a step back and kind of temper the hours that I was working and still spend some time with my family. We still worked hard. And there were days, I have to admit, that I didn't see my family as much as I would have liked. But there were also days that I was able to just take off and say, you know what, I'm focused with my family.
That's the beautiful thing right there too, because in certain jobs, you are required to put in those amount of hours, regardless if you have the option or not to say yes or no. When you're working as an attorney, you had to put in those hours. And if there was a family vacation, if there was a birthday, if there was a sporting event, you didn't always have the liberty to say, sorry, I'm going to stop working right now and go do this.
So true.
Yeah. I meet so many people now, they're in their full-time careers and they have to travel constantly for work. They are dictated by their boss how many hours they have to work. It's not like they're not hardworking. These people are very incredibly hardworking, but then it goes back to the balance of, okay, yeah, then they don't get to see their families. They don't get to have a social life. They don't get to exercise. They don't get to do these basic human necessities that we should probably all be living. But now, since you started your own businesses, you were able to set that aside and say, yes, of course, I'm still going to go to the office. I'm still going to get all my work done. Some nights I might have to work later than others. But at the same time, my kid has a sporting event. I'm going to go to it. My wife wants to go to dinner. I'm going to make sure I have time for that. What difference has that made inside of your life, and more importantly, in your family's life, to have you more available?
Yeah, that was huge. That was huge, Brandon. So when I walked away from law, I set some parameters and said, okay, if I'm going to walk away from law because of, my schedule, in other words, I don't want to recreate another schedule problem in my next career. So I had to set these boundaries. So I knew, if I was starting to work too much or not spend enough time with my family, that I could put myself in check. And so some of the things that I came up with, I just said, look, I will be at every baseball game. I will be at every dance recital. I will be at everything that my family needs me to be. I will be present when we're on vacation. I won't be worried about, sending emails or jumping on the phone or whatever I had to do. Back then it was a little easier because cell phones weren't as prolific as they are now. But it was still something that setting that boundary really helped me, because if I ever got close to that boundary, there was something to push back on me. Because it's like the last thing you want to do is walk away from the practice of law because of your schedule and then create a new schedule problem with your next career. So that really helped, having that boundary.
So looking back now, you finished the law degree. I'm going to jump into the story of your franchising and where it began. And you jumped into this atmosphere at a very interesting time, or right before one of the biggest recessions we saw here in the U.S. or in the world in general. Tell us a little bit about your journey. You just quit from your law practice. You had moved up to Utah. You started working with Jamba Juice. Were you a part owner? Were you just working for them? What was the
I had
layout?
some equity. I was a minority owner at the time, but I definitely had some equity. And because we were franchising, 110 stores in 3 years, that's quite a clip. And so I had to learn franchising. I was general counsel. I was vice president of development and general counsel for Jamba Juice. And so, franchising is a legal animal, and you've got to make sure that you got your ducks in line, both state-wise and federal law. And so it was great training ground, growing at that rate, interviewing people from all over the country, really all over the world in some ways. It was a great training ground to just really become an expert at franchising. And so then, after we sold Zuka Juice, we did another company called Rumby Island Grill, where we did some franchising with that too. And so it just parlayed right into that. And then starting Roxberry, I had that foundation of understanding and being really, really good at franchising. So from the very first day we opened the first Roxberry, we were set up and ready to franchise. I had all that taken care of. And it's a really blessing that I learned that earlier in my career.
And one story I really wanted to highlight as well, since you had the experience from all these different businesses, it propelled you, like you said, to, as soon as Roxberry opened, you hit the ground running, and you opened how many stores within the first couple of years of Roxberry?
We opened 3 stores really fast, like within 6 months of each other. And then January of 2009 hit, and that's when the recession hit, at least for us. And our sales just dropped exponentially. And so it was literally like someone just kind of turned the water off to the hose. Just like, wait a minute, what happened? And so we put our growth on hold for a while we tried to understand the scope and the breadth of what this recession was going to be like. And during that downtime is when I was tapped to be the president of a company called Abundant Brands. And we ultimately became the largest franchisee for Costa Vida. And we were what's called the development agent for Subway sandwiches. And so for the next 12 years of my life, I really, wore a Costa Vida hat and a Subway sandwich hat. And Roxberry was really on the back burner. It was still something that I loved. It was my baby. But it wasn't something that we were focused on at that time.
What made the other restaurants so profitable? Why was Subway and Costa Vida outperforming a place like Roxberry during a recession? Was there really that big of a margin difference? Was it just because they are well-known brands? Like you mentioned this to me off air, you said during the recession, and this makes perfect sense, people weren't spending money like they were beforehand. Yeah. So what made somebody go spend money at Subway and Costa Vida to occupy your time versus Roxberry?
Well, I think, first of all, Roxberry was brand new, and so we only had 3 stores. And so there wasn't a high awareness of who Roxberry was, whereas Costa Vida and Subway were more established brands. And so I think they were not hurt by the recession as much as Roxberry was. But also Roxberry was it wasn't considered, a necessity. Whereas, you needed substance, you needed a food. So you're going to grab a burrito versus a smoothie, perhaps. But then there's the other dynamic that was really interesting. Like Abundant Brands originally owned a concept called Bajío Mexican Grill. And at the time, Bajío was larger than Costa Vida, but Bajío was not doing well. And so my first assignment at Abundant Brands was to figure out what's going on with Bajío Mexican Grill, because it was failing where Costa Vida was thriving. And why is that? And to be honest, you could do an MBA study on that and still not figure out why. I looked at it hard, and I concluded that we were going to have to spend $3 or $4 million to try and change the trajectory of Bajío. But there wasn't a guarantee that 3 or 4 million would actually do it. So instead of doing that, what we did is we approached Costa Vida, a brand that was thriving during the recession. And we said, let's convert all of our Bajío Mexican restaurants into Costa Vida. So we forged a relationship and we gained a little equity in Costa Vida. And we almost overnight, over the period of a few months, we transitioned 20 Bajío Mexican grills into Costa Vida. And so we became the largest franchisee of Costa Vida and very principally connected. And that was our growth vehicle for many years.
And with that being your growth vehicle, I'm assuming Costa Vida, it obviously kept growing and growing. You had a minor stake. When you say you had a minor stake as far as equity goes, was that through Abundant Brands? Was that you personally? How did that break down?
That was through Abundant Brands, yes. And I had equity in Abundant Brands, and then Abundant Brands had equity in Costa Vida. Yeah.
So obviously, I don't want you to sit here and break down all the math for everyone. That's your own personal information. When it comes to the restaurant industry and franchising specifically, two interesting concepts you've talked a lot about was getting the initial equity when it came to Zika Juice or Zuka Juice.
Zuka. Yeah.
And then also when it came to Abundant Brands, splitting off into Costa Vida and all these different Subways and Roxberries and whatnot. As a franchisor, you're nailed the head dog with all of it. How does it work with franchisees to go out and actually start their own Roxberry or Costa Vida or whatever it is?
Yeah. So franchising, it's its own set of challenges, because the good thing about franchising is you're growing on the franchisee's dime. You know, there's two ways to grow. Obviously, you can grow company-owned stores or franchise stores. And if you have the capital, it's probably more advantageous to grow company-owned stores because your profit is better. Because like most franchise organizations charge anywhere from 5 to 8 or 10% royalty. And that's how they make their money off the franchise stores. So if a franchise store makes $1 million in sales and you have a 6% royalty, they're paying you $60,000 a year to use your name and your likeness in your system, right? But if you owned that store, you would be making 20 or 30% profit off of that $1 million sales plus the 6% royalty. So it's more advantageous financially if you can afford to build your own stores and have them as company-owned stores. But if you don't have that capital, or you don't want to dilute your equity by raising that capital, then you can just grow with franchising. And you find those people that are desirous of franchising with you, and they put up all the capital to build the stores. They put up all the capital to fixturize that store. And then they just basically rent your name and likeness from you. And of course you have to support them and teach them and nurture them along. And so you're not free from obligations. You still have a lot of obligations, but it's a very good way to do that. The only downside to it, well, there's a lot of pros and cons, but franchisees come with a mixed bag. You have some franchisees that are amazing and will follow your system, and they're just gung-ho about it. You'll have other franchisees that, you'll lay out the system for them, but they second guess it all along the way. And those are the ones you try and avoid. But it's hard to, because no matter how you vet or how you try and determine if they're going to be a good franchisee or not, you'll always have some fall through the cracks.
That's a lesson we've all seen on the Founder movie,
Yes.
the origins of Ray Kroc and
Yes.
McDonald's. It's so interesting. That movie, I'm sure there's more to his background. I don't know enough about him specifically. The movie paints him as kind of a harsh villain. We can get your take on that in a second.
Yeah, I think Ray Kroc was a visionary, to be sure, but he was also cutthroat. And sometimes, the more successful you are, the more, brutal you are too, because you almost have to be, especially in that franchise world where he didn't have like now at Roxbury's stage. I have the McDonald's of the world and the Subways of the world and the Wendy's of the world and all of these concepts that have we can learn from, the do's and don'ts of what they did. And it's like going to, an MBA school, learning from their mistakes and their successes. Where at the time with Ray Kroc, he didn't have that. There was only a few brands out there. Like I think one of the pizza brands, Domino's and Pizza Hut, I think they were just starting to franchise too. So they were all learning on their own dime and based on their own wisdom or lack thereof. And so Ray Kroc was a visionary, to be sure, but he was also a businessman. And I think some of the early franchisees learned that pretty fast.
Yeah, I mean, once again, you definitely know more about him than I do, but just from the depictions of the movies and the stories you hear, yeah, I mean, the original McDonald's brothers, it seems like they were ousted of everything, but they signed away their rights to the business as well. So kind of a double-sided coin there for you.
I have always found that whether you're working with a friend or an acquaintance or even a stranger, when it comes time to counting the money, people get selfish. And so it's very, very important, I would say critically important, to document everything in writing, your relationships, your areas of responsibility, how you're going to split the money. And it's even more important, Brandon, to do that when you're working with someone you know, someone that's a good friend of yours, because oftentimes you rely on that friendship with saying, "Oh, when it comes time to divide the money or sell the business or whatever exit you have, you think, oh well, we'll see eye to eye." I promise you, you won't. And so it's very, very important to document everything. And in that Ray Kroc scenario, you may recall from the movie, he promised them more equity. He promised them more money with time. But he said, I can't put it in writing because of the board. They won't let me put it in writing. But I promise you we're going to do it. And of course, that never happened, right? And so that those brothers lost out on that future income. If they would have demanded it in writing, they would have got it at the time, and it would have been a whole different scenario for all of their heirs and to come.
So looking at where you guys are at in this stage now, your Roxberry is still growing, very steady growth, nothing too crazy fast, nothing too crazy slow. I want to hear some more about the next steps. But before, one question I have is based upon the subject of Ray Kroc. An issue he had was when he started franchising out these McDonald's, he went to those very prominent business owners and he said, all right, I'm going to give you this amazing opportunity. It was obviously selling very, very well. But then the issue came where they all put their own spin on it. One restaurant was selling the chicken, the other one wasn't. One was totally changing the recipes. One had different styles. And that's obviously a big no-no nowadays when it comes to franchising. And so I want to hear what happens in your case. You bring on a new partner. They open up a new location. They have to stick to your menu for the most part. But what happens if they start going off the rails? I'm sure there's legal binding behind that.
Correct. Yeah, that's... You want someone entrepreneurial enough to want to be in business for themselves, but not so entrepreneurial that they want to second guess your system. But it's kind of human nature to second guess a little bit. And so you're inevitably going to find some franchise partners that will want to shake things up a little bit. And so you have to have a written agreement that's written very strictly, very, with boundaries. And it's not that we're trying to big brother our franchisees and try and keep them in their lane, by being a mean person. It's just we have to look at it this way. Every store that opens, someone has put a lot of money into that store, a lot of time into that store, a lot of care and effort into that store. And if a store starts bucking the system and selling a substandard strawberry or doing something that's not within, the system, I have to be able to shut that down, and I have to have a mechanism to be able to do that. And that mechanism is the franchise agreement. So it has to be written very, very strictly. And I'm not doing that to just try and be a bully. I'm doing that because I need to protect the investment of every other franchisee out there. Because if I don't, that one store that's selling that substandard strawberry is devaluing the investment and the time and the efforts that all the other stores have put in. So franchising is a rare animal that it requires some strict documents.
Now, knowing all of that, it's a very interesting realm. Like you said, it's entrepreneurial in the sense, obviously, in your case, when you're the main owner of it. And know what I was thinking of, right? When you said you want to be entrepreneurial for your franchisees, you want them to be entrepreneurial, but not too entrepreneurial. You could correct me if I'm wrong here. These are the types of entrepreneurs I see who want to go out and build something. They kind of want to, like you said, work for themselves, have their own freedoms. But at the same time, they still like a little bit of structure. They like following the rules, and they like the entire mentality of these are the guidelines. You could play around within the guidelines a little bit, but these are the rules we have set up.
Correct. And you'll have some that don't. I mean, we had one early franchisee that wanted to sell a breakfast burrito, and he wanted to sell a pizza, and you have to politely tell them, look, that's we don't do that. That's not who we are. That's not how we do our business. And if you're doing it here, how is that going to impact all the other stores? And so ultimately, we had to ask him to exit the system. And I'm still friends with him today, fortunately, because it was very amicable. And he has since come to me and said, man, I wish I just followed your system. But he's a real entrepreneur. He owns a bunch of hotels and he wants car washes and stuff. And in those worlds, he has no he has no boundaries because he's his own boundary. But when you jump into the franchise world, it's different because it's your business, but it's not your system. So you have to appreciate and follow that you're following a system and not buck that system.
So as we're kind of closing out here, I got to ask, what's the trajectory of Roxberry? Where's it going? Are you guys planning on expanding more? What's the future growth? You also joked about this with me a few weeks ago about every time you seem to try and grow Roxberry, God tries to tell you a different lesson. So yeah, what's the next lesson or what's the next step?
Well, yeah, just to recap just a sec, when we first started Roxberry, it ended up being in the middle of this recession. And then we put it on the back burner while I focused on Costa Vida, like I said. And then when in 2019, right at the end of 2019, I sold out of everything. And the goal again was to focus 100% on Roxberry. And then, as you may recall, just a few months later, we were in the middle of COVID, right? So then as we're coming out of COVID, I'm like, okay, now we'll grow. Well, then we went into this crazy supply chain problem where it was full court press, Brandon, just to try and keep our stores, outfitted with enough strawberries to make our smoothies, So there's been 3 times that I have wanted to just run with Roxberry. And something has shut me down every time, and now I think it's kind of caused us to reassess. And another obstacle right now for Roxberry's growth is real estate. It's very, very hard to find a drive-through location. It's hard to find one that you can afford because the costs of real estate have gone up so much. So we've kind of decided with Roxberry that we still want to grow. Growth is who we are. It's in our DNA. We definitely want to grow, but it's not going to be a sprint. It might not even be a jog. It might be a brisk walk. It's kind of where we're at right now. And to the extent we can find real estate that's advantageous and cost effective and makes sense, we're going to grow. And the goal is just one store at a time.
Where do you see real estate opening back up here in the next few years? It's from a younger perspective with myself, and I got my wife, Bryn, obviously sitting behind us here in today's episode. It's kind of scary in our realm where we think we're going to be in kind of the cusp where, at least from the housing perspective, yours is obviously commercial real estate, but from the housing perspective, we think, okay, we'll be able to slide in here and we'll be okay. We'll be okay. But then you think about when we start having kids and when they start to becoming our age, I really start to question where we're headed as a country and thinking, is this going to be possible? And that was always the case for residential, a little bit more so than commercial, I think, especially smaller locations. But this brisk walk you're on, is it something you could at least see a future in, or where are we headed?
Well, I wish I had a crystal ball and I could answer that question with confidence. But when 15 years ago, when we started Roxberry, we were able to lease commercial space for sometimes under $20 a square foot. Sometimes it was 15. But now, to get a drive-through space, if I can find something for under $50 per square foot, that's a huge win. Most of them are $55, even $60 a square foot. That's almost prohibitive because, by the time you pay rent, pay all your employees, pay for all your food costs, pay all your utilities, there's not much left over after all of that. So where do I think it's going to go? I think we'll see a little bit of softening as the interest rates go down. And hopefully the interest rates will go down. They were originally talking about dropping them, 4 or 5 times this year. Now there's people saying that they won't drop at all, or while a few people are saying that they might drop toward the end of the year. But at the end of the day, our interest rates are high, and they're going to be high for quite a while, I think. And with the interest rates high, those that are buying the real estate and those that are developing the real estate are borrowing that money at a high clip. And so they've got to, in turn, make money on that. So they're going to charge more for it. So I don't know exactly where that's going, but I do know that construction costs are coming down a little bit. They're a little bit more in the realm of reasonableness now. And so I'm hoping that will ultimately translate a little bit more into real estate.
And what interests me, once again, from the younger perspective too, is so many of my generation that have the entrepreneurial mind, many of the listeners on this podcast, they're turning away more from the physical, the restaurants, the retail, the product-based businesses. And they're doing exactly what I'm working on here. They're jumping into the software realm.
Yeah.
They're recognizing how expensive your costs are. And maybe you can bring this up if you feel appropriate as well. Some of the cost compared to how much you would actually walk away with in the end. Then the software game, I mean, you're paying for other software, you're paying for servers, you're paying for high labor costs, obviously, with developers and whatnot. But in the grand scheme of things, you can make a lot more money in software. So where do you see the turn in the next few generations?
You know what? I think you're smart to be focused on software. If I had a crystal ball when I was your age, I think I still would have dabbled because I enjoy brick and mortar building. But I also am enamored with e-commerce and what's going on with all of that. And one of the cool things that opened my eyes a lot before COVID hit, I saw the vision of having an app for Roxberry, and we knew that we had some stores that didn't have drive-throughs, and we knew that was a hurdle for us. And so we had developed an app that we called the virtual drive-through. And, if a person ordered on their app, they could not only order and pay for their product, but they could put the where they parked and the name and make of their car. And so then we could just do curbside service with them. So when COVID hit, we were one of the only restaurants that had an app that already catered to curbside service. And so we were getting, for Little Roxbury, we were getting thousands. We were getting like 3,000 or 4,000 every day downloads of our app, which is pretty good for Little Roxbury. And so it really opened my eyes that, e-commerce it's an amazing thing. And then of course, going through COVID, everyone's ordering online. Now it's all about DoorDash. But even, look at what happened with Amazon. I'm an older guy, right? And for me to adopt online ordering was a kind of a big deal for me. But now, dude, if I'm not getting a package every other day, it's weird, So I really think if I were starting over, that I would be less inclined to go brick and mortar and more inclined to go digital e-commerce.
Well, what you just said there was 100% true. Just this morning, Bryn is texting me before she gets here to the office to hear you speak. And she goes, okay, I'm ordering our groceries. What do you want us to get? And then we're going to, exactly what you just mentioned, we're going to pull up to our grocery store at Macy's. We're going to park in a little stall and somebody's going to come out and bring them to us. The days of us walking around the grocery store, this sounds dumb, but it was almost like a waste of time. You walk around, it takes a long time, especially with, you see all the families inside, they got the kicking and screaming kids. What you just mentioned just purely makes sense. You pull up, you get the thing, and you go about your merry day.
It's a whole new world we live in right now. I can't imagine that growing up, but I agree. We order our groceries online, just like you do.
And one other vote of confidence where I think you could get the mix as well with how you said e-commerce is kind of the thing you're so interested in nowadays. I think there's still groups of my generation who are going to grow up and still make physical products. They're still going to have these amazing restaurants and amazing things. It's just going to be done in a different fashion than what we're used to. Heck, the office space right next door to us, I don't know if you had the privilege of talking with them today. Their company name is called Otishi. They make a gym shoe. So it's a physical product. They make a shoe, but everything they do, they don't have any storefronts. They're not selling in any outlets, at least for now, but everything they're doing is online.
Yeah.
And so they're kind of mixing the two a little bit.
It's interesting that you say that, because even with Roxberry, we are going to be exploring some online products that not necessarily a smoothie, but some of the supplements that we put in our smoothies and things like that. But we're also exploring with, vending machines and things like that, to put in office towers and things because people aren't venturing out as much as they used to. We need to also build in our business, we need to build those third-party deliveries like DoorDash, because people are willing to pay a little bit more than they would pay if they just walked into our store, just for the convenience of having it delivered to their front door. And that's a real interesting thing for me, because growing up, it was all about value in terms of the dollar savings. Now it's all about value in terms of the time savings. There's not as much scrutiny on what it costs, as much scrutiny as what my time is dedicated to it. And I think with the new generation, that's going to be something that you need to play into.
Definitely. So, Brad, as we kind of close out the episode today, one topic we have not hit on, which I know it is a very important topic in my life and especially your life as well, is your spiritual side. I want to hear, you don't have to go into the nitty gritty details. That would be an entire 2-hour podcast. We could talk about that in and of itself. Tell us about the experiences that you've seen inside of your life, where God has played a role inside of Roxberry and all your other business ventures, and how your faith has shaped who you are as a businessman.
Wow. Yeah, you're right. We could talk forever on that. But in a nutshell, that's why I walked away from practicing law. I was achieving all of my goals, everything from, the amount of money I was making to the partnership track that I was on to just the satisfaction of a job. And I generally, you'd never walk away from that because you're so entrenched and happy with it. But I was failing as a father and I was failing as a husband because I was gone so much. And I didn't really see that until that epiphany that day where I missed my son's birthday, where it all came into clear focus. And so I had to check myself and I had to say, what is most important? It doesn't matter at the end of the day how big your bank account is when you die. It doesn't matter, what credibility you have out there as an attorney or as a businessman. What matters is the relationship you have with your family, the relationship you have with your God, and the relationship that you're able to, cultivate with your friends and families. And so it's a big checks and balance. I always talk about, how do you have balance in your life? And the one area that I think is always, helpful is when you look at, what would God do? What would our Heavenly Father want me to do? Would He want me to work that extra hour tonight, or would He want me to go tuck my kid in bed? And I think if you use that as a barometer, you're gold. You're gonna be a great father, husband, wife, spouse, whatever.
The quote you just reminded me of, I just pulled this up. It says, it's by David O. McKay. I'm sure you've heard this one a lot. No other success can compensate for failure in the home. The poor shack in which we love prevails over a united family is of greater value to God and future humanity that any other riches in such a home. God can work miracles and will work miracles. We both had experiences going on LDS missions. I'm sure you saw families who were in that exact same boat. They lived in poverty, but somehow they were still so dang happy. And it didn't matter what was going on outside in the world. If they could bring the love and the values that they knew were correct, if they could bring that into the home, they were the richest people on earth. Yeah. Our grandpa, or your dad, he had a saying where he said, he would say this quite often, I'm just the richest man in the world. And he never meant it because of actual physical dollar bills or the size of his home or the cars he drove. Heck, he always had a beat up pickup truck or something in the driveway. He said it because it was because of the family. Yeah. So.
Well, you mentioned my dad. He recently passed away, so he's obviously on our minds a lot right now. But he used to quote that David O. McKay quote all the time to us, and so I grew up, really entrenched with that. And really good example. I'm sure your dad's probably told you this, or grandpa maybe told you. When your dad was a little boy, there was a very successful businessman that wanted to buy him from grandpa. Right? So here's this man who had achieved whatever financial goals that he wanted in life, but realized that was meaningless compared to having a family. And so he was willing to buy a child, buy your father, to try and compensate and bring that family into his life. And I think that's like the ultimate example of, oh crap, what did I just do? He realized he screwed up. He put the worldly goals ahead of his spiritual goals. And if you do that, you're just going to live a life of unhappiness. There might be some temporary happiness, based on, what you're able to accomplish, but it's not lasting happiness. That's for sure. And now that I know my dad's on the other side, I want to live my life in a way that is going to emulate his life. His life, every time you talk to him, he was all about Heavenly Father, all about spirituality. And so that I grew up with that. And now that he's gone, it's almost like I want to embrace that even more now that he's gone, because I know that he sees me better than he saw me. If he lived in California, I lived here. He couldn't physically see me. Now he can. So now I'm like, dude, I gotta up my game a little bit more again, because I want to emulate him more.
Well, and it goes back to the entire concept. Like when you're younger, you might agree with your dad, or you might get in fights with them a little bit, and you always say, "I'm never going to end up like you. I don't want to act the same. I don't want to have the same rules." But then, as you get a little older and a little bit wiser, and you go, "Well, you actually did a pretty good job there."
Yeah, there was wisdom in what they were doing for sure. Yeah.
So, Brad, as we're closing out right now, I want to hear your one final piece of advice. Everyone on the Get Over Yourself podcast today, it's young entrepreneurs. They're trying to make a name for themselves. They're trying to get to a point in life where you are at right now with their businesses, the various types they may be. If you could give them one final piece of advice, what would you tell them and why?
Oh, that's a good question. Definitely set a goal, have a target in your life. And be willing to reevaluate that as you go. But don't just follow what the world wants you to do. Listen and be intent in your own course. Set your own course. The world will throw a lot of curveballs at you, and if you let those curveballs affect your trajectory in life, you're gonna land in a lot of landfills. You're gonna land in places you don't want to be. So you've got to have a goal in mind, and whether that goal can be all encompassing. Spiritual, emotional, physical, financial. Have those goals with a mindset that that's what I want, but I'm not going to jeopardize my family or my spirituality to get it. But just don't follow what the world wants you to do. My father was the greatest example of that. The world would tell you to go left or go right. Whatever the world was telling you to do, he would almost inevitably and unapologetically go the route, because that's what he knew he needed to do. And if you follow your gut, you follow your instincts, and always ask yourself, what would my Heavenly Father want me to do? Then you're gold.
That's perfect. Well, thank you, Brad. Once again, awesome episode, not just because I'm coming in from the business side and love all the stories you share, but it's very cool to sit down with another family member, one of my awesome uncles, and hear some of these stories. So thanks for coming on.
Dude, this was awesome. I appreciate you having me on.
Yeah.
I need to do it again.
Definitely. Everyone, thank you so much for listening to today's conversation on the Get Over Yourself podcast. If you heard anything in today's conversation that you feel like could benefit one of your friends, family members, coworkers, or anyone in between, make sure to share the episode. You guys are my best form of marketing, so we can continue to grow the show. Likewise, if you're a new listener here, I hope you come back next week. And if you enjoyed the episode, make sure to leave us a 5-star review. And with that all being said, we'll see you guys next time.